and suddenly Hassan's voice whispered in my ear, "For you, 1,000 times over." Hassan, the hair-lipped kite runner. There is a way to be good again. I thought of the life I'd lived in Kabul until the winter of 1975 came along and changed everything.
Hi, my name is Khaled Hosseini. I was born in 1965 in Kabul and was fortunate to live through the final few years of what's now a forgotten era in Afghanistan. In those days, when I grew up in the 60s and 70s, Afghanistan was a country living in anonymity, at peace with itself and with its neighbors. And my personal recollections are of my childhood in Afghanistan are very happy and cheerful.
There's so many myths about Afghanistan, and a lot of it is a byproduct of how Afghanistan is portrayed, especially in the West, especially in this country, I think. It's when you see pictures of Afghanistan, there's usually a reporter, and he's standing somewhere really dusty, and there's people cowering in the background, with blankets and turbans on them, and it just looks like it's this desolate, dusty, awful, terrible place. One of the things that art of any form, be it literature, be it photography, music, movies, can do is to take something that's very foreign and distant and alien and render it somehow accessible and more understandable. I remember one time I was signing a book somewhere and this lady said, I had no idea there were trees in Afghanistan. Because you never get to see a tree. It's always like, Tora Bora, the caves of Tora Bora. It's always some god-awful thing. And I said, well, in the north of Afghanistan, it's really lush. And there's valleys, and there's amazing, amazing green hills and mountains and trees. And it's really gorgeous, actually. It's stunning. And so people always kind of find things in my book that they didn't know about Afghanistan. Like people, like women actually drove, and that they didn't have to wear
careers, they had
veil.
jobs.
They were lawyers, and they were doctors, and they were, women in my family were university professors and so on. All this kind of came as a shock because everybody thinks Afghanistan is what it has been since the Taliban.
I was born and raised in Kabul. We lived in a neighborhood called Wazir Akbar Khan, which was one of the up-and-coming neighborhoods in Kabul. My father was a diplomat. He worked for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Kabul, and my mother taught Farsi and history at a very large high school for girls, and left just before the communist, couple of years before the communist coup in 1976. We came to the U.S. in 1980. This was a few months after the Soviets invaded, right around the time that President Reagan was elected, just before. And there was a seed of Afghan communities in the East Coast and the West Coast. We were one of the early families that came to the U.S. in Northern California. We lived in San Jose. My family still lives there. And there were a number of families there already. Some of them we knew, some we got to know. And then over the ensuing decade or two, we watched that community explode. Now that community is about, I would say, maybe 80, 90,000 people, maybe more. And there's Afghan businesses and people interacting, and Afghan social clubs and organizations and so on and so forth. Afghanistan was a monarchy for over 200 years. We had King Zahir Shah, who passed away within the last year. King Zahir Shah had been on the throne since 1933. In 1963, a couple of years before I was born, he instituted a constitutional monarchy, and that was in effect for about 10 years. My memory of that era is that it was very peaceful and quiet. But in retrospect, it was an interesting time politically, a time of polarization, and to some extent, people were disillusioned with sort of the reforms and promises that had been made through the constitutional monarchy that never really panned out. And that was a circumstance under which the king was overthrown in 1973. He was away in Italy getting medical treatment, and his first cousin overthrew him in a bloodless coup and took over. And Afghanistan's era of monarchy was over, and it became a republic. I actually remember the night that the king was overthrown. I was in Kabul. My parents were at the hospital where my mother was giving birth to my youngest brother that night, and we heard the gunshots, and we heard the tanks rolling in and all the rumbling, and I was home with my grandmother, and I said, you know, what is that noise? And she said, oh, they hunt ducks at night, don't worry about it, they're just hunting ducks. I wake up in the morning, and there's a couple of buildings have been damaged and so on, but otherwise there was not much violence, and we woke up to a whole new country. So that was the reality, the political reality at that time, and then again there were economic reforms and more promises and so on made, and I left in 1973 when the president Dawood Khan was still in power. Afghanistan is a kaleidoscope of different ethnicities, tribes, sub-tribes, families, and so on. And every region has its own dialect and its own, really its own local culture. That said, you know, so there are many, many different dialects, but the two main languages that were spoken and still are at that time were Farsi or Dari, which is the probably the more correct way of saying it. We share the same language. We speak the same language as in Iran. They call it Persian or Farsi. In Afghanistan, we speak that language. In Afghanistan, it's called Dari. It's a slightly different dialect. I went to high school. My family moved to the U.S. in 1980, September of 80. 2 weeks later, I was in high school in a regular English language class. In terms of fitting in, and I felt like a complete outsider. I felt like I was like looking in through the glass at a party that was going on, and I wasn't invited to it. I didn't really understand the behavior and the mores of high school, all the different cliques. I felt like the only people that I kind of connected with at that time were other refugees. And there weren't that many Afghans at that time. As I said, there was only a handful of families at that time. So there was a lot of Cambodian refugees, and I became friends with them. Probably my first year of high school, I hung out with them. When I started writing The Kite Runner, which was in the novel, which was in March of 2001, by then I had been in the States for over 20 years. I had been writing most of my life. I started as a kid in Kabul and wrote steadily most of my life, with the exception of the 4 years of medical school and 3 years of residency, which really takes away everything from you, and you basically are slave to your schedule. You know, there's some parallels between my life and the life of the boy in The Kite Runner. I grew up in Kabul the same era. I went to the same school. You know, we both were kind of precocious writers. We both loved film, loved those early westerns of the 60s and 70s. We, you know, loved poetry and reading and writing from a young age, both me and this character. And both of us left Afghanistan and became political refugees in the U.S. And probably the sections in the book that resemble my life more than any other are the ones in the Bay Area where Amir and his father are selling the goods at the flea market and socializing with other Afghans who'd left Afghanistan. I did that with my father, and we go to the flea market to sell some junk, and we just socialize with other Afghans. So there's quite a bit of me in the book. The storyline itself, what happens between the boys and the fallout from that, that's all imagination. As I remember when I was a kid in Kabul writing stories, you know, all those stories, now that I think about them, and I don't remember them all, but I remember some of them, had this idea of social class, and had this theme of the clash between the different social classes and the kind of the inequities that exist in the world. Because when you grow up in a third world country, you know, poverty and affluence are juxtaposed. It's literally next door. You don't have to go to another zip code. It's right there, and you walk out the street, and there's, you know, there are beggars and so on and so forth. So it becomes part of your life, and you can either not reflect on it, but I must have, because I remember my stories always had to do with these things. There was always some guy who came from a very affluent background and some person who came from a much less privileged background, and their lives collided in some way, and tragedy would ensue inevitably. I mean, sort of a recurring theme in my story, and The Kite Runner is very similar to that. These issues of contempt and rivalry between the ethnicities, for instance, between the Pashtuns and Hazaras, this goes back centuries, and it has very bitter old roots and wounds that have not healed. And this book talks about those things in a very unveiled, open fashion. The Taliban's proclamations have a root in history in Afghanistan for centuries. They did not create these things out of thin air. There was already a seed for these proclamations. Afghanistan is largely a rural country that is religious and uneducated. That's the sad truth. In many parts of Afghanistan, at least in the tribal and Pashtun regions of Afghanistan, the way the Taliban perceive the role of women in society is pretty much the way women have been perceived for a long time. In that tribal code of life, it is considered dishonorable for your wife, your sister, to be seen in public by the eyes of a stranger, to be seen alone, to be seen that she's speaking with a stranger. It is considered an insult to the family. The thing that was really remarkable about the Taliban was that they took something that is a tribal custom in some parts of Afghanistan and turned it into national law and imposed it on the entire populace at large. And that was a shock to the system for urban professional women in Kabul who grown up working in universities as doctors, as lawyers, as teachers, and suddenly they had to behave like illiterate, uneducated young woman from a village, in the middle of a desert outside of Kandahar. Suddenly they had to be indoors all the time, couldn't work, couldn't get an education, had to fully cover when they go outside, and the litany of things that have now become very, very familiar to the public.
For years, Khaled Hosseini was a doctor whose passion lay in creating life on the page. And to his delight, Hosseini's first novel, The Kite Runner, took on a life of its own. More than 100 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. That success brought Hosseini a new vocation, UN Goodwill Envoy, then Goodwill Ambassador, for the organization's refugee agency, as well as the head of a nonprofit that addresses social needs in his native Afghanistan. It's a marriage of Hosseini's art and his own experience as a refugee. And he's using the moment to discuss the power of literature, the need for the world to help those driven from their homes because of war and famine, and the future of his native land after decades of war.
People now, if they read my book, they see that there's so much more to Afghanistan than the caves of Tora Bora and the Taliban.
There is a way to be good again. For you, 1,000 times over.